Okay, we're going to start your notes over the Civil War. Hopefully this is a review from your 8th grade material. So hopefully this is not the first time you guys have heard this information, but we're just going to go through it so that you can remember it and have a really clear picture of it going into this unit. We talked about on Friday in your notes on the last video, we talked about the different causes of the Civil War. And now we're going to get into the different battles and major events that happen in the Civil War. So the beginnings of the war, just a little review from last time. After the election of 1860, President Lincoln is elected, and it made really a lot of the southern states very upset. They all thought that he was going to come in and abolish slavery, so they were very adamant about showing their discontent with this situation. The southern states, starting with South Carolina, begin to secede, and we remember the word secede means to withdraw. South Carolina secedes first, followed by Florida, Georgia, Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Those are the first set of southern states to secede from the Union. Just a few facts over the Civil War before we get into the actual events. When I say the word Union, I mean North. The Union was the North. The president of the Union obviously was Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln's goal throughout the Civil War was really to preserve the Union at all costs. He did not want the southern states to create their own nation. He was very upset about the secession. He also really didn't recognize the Confederacy as being another nation. So his goal, Lincoln wants to preserve the Union. A couple of important people that you need to know. The main general that you need to know about for the Union, he was the general for the western part of the war, is General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant eventually becomes the commander of the entire Union Army, but he starts out as just the Union commander in charge of the western portion of the war. The generals that are in the east, there actually are several. Lincoln actually puts about 4 generals into power in the east, but the general who starts out in manning the eastern front of the war is General George McClellan. But like I said, the main general that you need to know about is General Ulysses S. Grant. He starts out in the west, but he eventually takes control of the entire Union Army. The strategy of the Union Army was called the Anaconda Plan, and really it was just to smother the South's economy like a snake squeezes its prey. Their whole plan was basically to cut off the South from making money. As we know, the South makes all their money off of cotton, indigo, rice, tobacco, those big plantations. So it was their goal to kind of cut off their supply lines and block all their ports so that they couldn't trade with the other nations like Great Britain and France, and they also couldn't get supplies in. So that was the plan of the North. It was the Anaconda Plan. The North goes into this war with a lot of really important advantages. They had a lot more industry than the South, so they didn't have to rely on outside sources to make ammunition, to make guns, to make supplies. They also had a lot more railroads than the South, so they had ways to transport those supplies to their men. They had more money, they had a more stable government, they had more men, their population was larger, so they had a lot of really good things going into the war. The South, they were known as the Confederate States of America. That's the South. So whenever you hear the words Confederates, that's the South. They elected a president, Jefferson Davis, and their main general was Robert E. Lee. This is a picture of Robert E. Lee down here that's a little bit cut off, but you can see his face. The capital city of the Confederate States was Richmond, Virginia, and they pretty much took on the strategy of a defensive approach. Their strategy was just to defend their land. Because the Union was coming at them, they just kind of wanted to defend and keep the Union troops out of their borders. Advantages, most of the war was fought in the South, so they knew the land, they knew the terrain, they knew the forest, they knew all of the ins and outs of that land they were fighting on. And they really believed in what they were fighting for. They thought they were defending their economy and defending their way of life. So they really had a great spirit in the war. The disadvantages were kind of the playing off of the North's advantages. They had a lack of industry. They didn't have good ways to get supplies. They had to rely on outside sources to get those manufactured goods. They had an unstable government. They had this government that was just set up for them, so they really didn't have a firm stance like the North had the established government of the United States. So those were just some advantages and disadvantages going into the Civil War. As you guys know, hopefully you have heard me say this when we've done some tax review, the first battle of the Civil War, the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. What happens once the South secedes, once the southern states start to secede, the Confederacy is very quick to go up and try to seize federal property for themselves. So they tell the Union, this no longer belongs to you. You need to get out of Fort Sumter, which was a federal fort. So basically the Confederate troops go and they attack and they tell the Union troops, you need to leave. The Union men start to run out of supplies, so the Confederate leaders decide that they're going to attack Fort Sumter before the new shipment of supplies arrive, and the South fires on the fort for about 34 hours until Anderson finally surrenders and the South wins this battle. This is a huge battle. Obviously, it's the first battle, but the South wins. They're able to drive the Union Army out of Fort Sumter and take control of that fort. And Fort Sumter is right off of Charleston, South Carolina. This is a picture of it right here. It's on the water. It's a very good, obviously, access to the sea. So that was a very important fort for them to capture. A way I help you guys remember Fort Sumter. Remember, Fort Sumter is the first battle. So you need to remember that whenever it comes down to when we have tax questions over Fort Sumter. That we talk about in the Civil War is the Battle of Bull Run. After the attack at Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to come and join the Union Army, just to continue with their Anaconda plan to blockade those southern ports and to cut off the supply lines and destroy the economic security of the South. This action by Lincoln causes 4 more states to secede and to withdraw and join the Confederacy. Those states are Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. This battle, it's a very famous battle. It's where the famous Southern general Stonewall Jackson gets his namesake from, and that's a picture of him right here. There was a battle, the Union and Confederate forces, they clash at Bull Run Creek near a town called Manassas, and the Confederate and Union forces were fighting each other, and one Confederate soldier says to General Jackson, the enemy is coming in, and he says, then we need to let's bring our bayonets, let's bring our guns, kind of really rallied his troops and said, then we need to fight back. And the comment made, it's kind of controversial, but the legend is that the Confederate troops said, look at General Jackson, he's standing there like a stone wall. Let's fight, let's rally behind him. And as the Confederate forces, they attack the Union, they're firing and they're doing these screams, these yells, which became known as the rebel yells, which were these battle cries that were used by the Confederate Army. And it really kind of startled the Union forces and caused them to scatter. And that is also how Stonewall Jackson got his name, was from this comment from that Confederate soldier of him standing there like a stone wall. This battle was really important because the South won. The Confederates get a victory. It's really the first major battle of the Civil War. And in this battle, the North realizes that they were really underestimating the South when they only called for 75,000 volunteers, that maybe they needed to step up and get a real army assembled. So after this battle, Lincoln assembles an army of 300,000 men. Okay, at this point in the Civil War, it kind of splits between the Eastern Front and the Western Front. we're going to talk about the Eastern Front first. And like I talked about earlier, General George McClellan, he becomes the Union commander in the East. While he's training troops, a small naval battle takes place that's really important to talk about. This naval battle was called, it's sometimes called the Battle of the Ironclads, the battle at Hampton Roads. What happens at the naval battle? It's at Hampton Roads, Virginia, and it was two ironclad ships, the Monitor and the Merrimac. That's what those two ships are called. They start to fire back at each other, and it ends in a draw. So nobody wins. It's just they're firing shells back at each other, and it ends in a draw. Nobody wins. But the important thing about this naval battle is it ended the use of wooden ships in the Navy. It started the use of ironclad ships. So these two ships were very different because the other ships had been wooden. These were ironclad. So that was kind of an important part of the Civil War, contributed to the development of the Navy. After this battle, George McClellan, on the Eastern Front, he approaches Richmond, Virginia, to attack Confederate troops, and he meets Lee at the Battle of 7 Days. And McClellan is eventually forced back by the Confederate troops to retreat. The Second Battle of Bull Run is another battle that happens on the Eastern Front, and Stonewall Jackson and General Lee are able to defeat Union troops. So the South is experiencing a lot of victories early on in the war on the Eastern Front. General Lee, Robert E. Lee for the South, he tries to go in, he tries to invade Union territory. He invades Maryland, so he's experienced a lot of victories. He's feeling really good. So he invades Maryland with about 55,000 men, and this was at the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam is actually a very famous battle. It's known as one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War because this is where we had a huge amount of casualties was suffered at this battle. It was extremely gory, extremely bloody. I think Lee was a little bit ambitious when he comes into Union land to attack, and the battle was fought. There was a fire exchanged, and Lee was eventually forced to retreat back down into Virginia. This battle resulted in heavy losses on both sides. It estimated about 24,000 troops were killed. That's an extra zero there. Oopsie. It's known as one of the bloodiest battles in the Civil War. So it's a really important battle. Both sides suffered really heavy losses, so it was really good on no one. The main thing about Antietam that's important is once Lee retreats, George McClellan doesn't follow him into Virginia to finish off the war. And this makes Lincoln really upset because he really wants McClellan to go and finish off the war and get the Union back together. So Lincoln loses his patience. Oops, I have a spelling error. Lincoln loses his patience with George McClellan and fires him as the general in the East and replaces him with General Ambrose Burnside. Just a side note, if you have Mr. Douglas, you can take this spelling error to him for extra credit. In December 1862, Lee defeats Ambrose Burnside's army at the Battle of Fredericksburg. So Burnside resigns and General Hooker takes command. So we see here after Lincoln loses his patience with McClellan is forced out. We go through two more generals in the East. So you can tell that Lincoln is really losing his patience with this war. He really wants it to be over. General Lee is able to defeat General Hooker at the Battle of Chancellorsville. So the South gets another victory there. What's important about the Battle of Chancellorsville, and it's actually cut off of this video, but it's really important to know that the South, while they do win this battle, they suffer a devastating loss. Stonewall Jackson is actually killed in this battle. He is accidentally shot by friendly fire, so he's accidentally shot by one of his own men. and he dies about 8 days later. So it was a really devastating